Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the office. No, I still don't have that tooth repaired yet, but we're working on it. We're working on it. Probably won't even be repaired in the time that I'm with you, and that is very sad, but we must press on. And unlike snow days at the university, there is no reason for us not to have some videos and continue our reading this week because I think those were our last snow days. At least I'm hopeful that they were our last snow days because I really jam-packed the medieval period for you with readings. And then we had all this time off. And so now we're a little bit behind schedule, which is fine. I have no issue with that. But we're going to have to make some changes. So one of the first changes I'm going to make, and hopefully you haven't gotten this far yet. I don't believe most of you would have. Let's just cancel reading Erasmus, his work on copia, which literally means a lot, a plethora. And he talks about why more words are not always better, why there are better words that could sometimes be used, and when you need to use more words than less, or more than fewer. So literally that kind of wraps him up. And so we're not going to worry about him. We're not going to put him on a test. We're not going to read him. So just skip the reading. But the other four that I have on your syllabus, which is St. Augustine, De Pizan, Ramus, and Bacon, those four we have to cover. So let's start off with just some question. What is the medieval period? Well, first of all, it is debated among historians as to whether it lasts, like, I believe the shortest time is 800 years, or I've heard all the way to 1600 years. So somewhere in there. There's no real time period when the medieval age just started and one day we became enlightened and that was that. So it took a lot of years, and whether it's 800 or 1600, I think we can all just agree it was a long freaking time. I personally like to choose about 1200 years. That sort of puts me in the middle a little bit, and I'm grateful that we can average that out. The question is, how do we get from the Holy Roman Empire, which we just left, all the way to the introduction of the moderns in such like a short period of time as far as our course studies are concerned? Because literally I have it scheduled for 1 week to cover, time-wise, half of this course. So the answer to that question is pretty simple. The medieval period begins somewhere around, again, this is debatable, but somewhere around 400 CE and goes to somewhere around 1600 CE. That's sort of the numbers. Those are the numbers I sort of use. It's a rough guesstimate enough for the purposes of our course. During that time, we know that we saw the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. And what that meant was that the empire, the Roman Empire, was now being run by the Pope. No longer was there a separation between a religious leader and a monarchical leader or a governmental leader of some kind. It was now one and the same. So whatever the Pope said goes. Now, to add insult to injury on top of that is this small, tiny little thing, which is that it was a religious organization. Like, it's the Catholic Church, like the Holy Roman Catholic Church is what that all stands for. So the Holy Roman Catholic Church was in charge. What were they in charge of? Everything. This is where we see the introduction of the feudal system, where kings are serving the Pope. The knights are serving the kings, or the lords and ladies are serving the kings. The knights are serving the lords and ladies. The peasants are working on the fields, on their little fiefdom, if you will. little piece of land that they worked for generations, because there was no need for scientific discovery. There was no need to ask the questions that had been asked over the last century, or over the last millennium. There was no need to ask these questions because God was the answer. God is the answer to everything at this point in the Western world. And when I say God here, I'm talking about the Western interpretation and the Catholic interpretation of God. And this is where we also get into things like divine right theory, that the king is dictated or blessed by the Pope, and is in charge, therefore, of the kings. The Pope is in charge, and therefore they do what they need to do to please the Pope. Those kinds of things were going on. So if we didn't have any need for scientific exploration or to answer any questions that we didn't understand because we merely turned to the Bible, then what did we need rhetoric for? Remember, I said the more decentralized a government system, the less or the greater the need for rhetoric, right? But now we're working with an extremely centralized governmental system. There's one thing in power the most, and that is the church. So whatever the Pope says goes. Therefore, there was no need for the practice of rhetoric. There was no need to explore questions and scientific ideas. There was no need to try to find out anything that was beyond the scope of God, because if we couldn't find the answer from the Bible, from God, or the papacy, then we couldn't find the answer. Literally, that's how that came about. So where's the room for rhetoric in a world like that? Well, first of all, there were still courtrooms and there were still students that needed to be taught. They just were all at, they were studying in monasteries, they were studying in the church. Usually your oldest child went to be a nun or went to be a priest. And in the Eastern world, we get a lot more from them. I mean, first of all, they were the reason why these texts were preserved. We owe a great debt to them for that. But they were able to utilize not necessarily the ideas of rhetoric, but the strategies for finding truth was definitely something that they were interested in. Finding out what the truth was, what the meaning of life was. Remember, philosophy is the study of life. So we have a sort of stopping point in Western countries, in Western world, I should say. So the Western Hemisphere just kind of stopped doing a whole lot other than working on their farms or going to war for the king, or we're talking about some Game of Thrones kind of stuff here. Did you ever hear them sit around and talk about like the latest machinery or technology that they could use? I mean, that just wasn't there. And the reason it wasn't there was because they were worried about so many other things. But the same thing sort of happens here. So who can we talk about? Well, first of all, let me tell you, I am not ignoring the Eastern writers on purpose. Well, I guess I am. It's a deliberate choice. And it's a deliberate choice because, number one, I still haven't figured out exactly how to teach that and keep it within the realm of our understanding of rhetoric and our timeline. Number two, I just simply don't have the time to go through all of that because it's an entire other history, a different culture. But I do want to emphasize that those readings are not unimportant. They're very important. Understanding how texts got preserved, understanding how the Eastern world was working, those are very important things. They just weren't important to the development of Western philosophy. Okay, not right now, at least. So I don't want it to seem like those are unimportant. What we end up with are very few texts, very few things to work with during the medieval period because of that. All right. So the main one that I usually work with is St. Augustine. And I do that at the cost of not studying Boethius. I do that at the cost of not studying the Eastern philosophers, as I said. I do it at a high cost, but the reason that I do it is because the question of what were people debating? How was there possibly rhetoric? How could we get to a point of stasis if the answer was always there? If it was always God, always the Pope, always the Bible? Well, the answer to that question is that in order to convert more people, in order to please the crowds and teach them about what's in the Bible, you needed some rhetoricians. And that was the argument that St. Augustine made. If you've read St. Augustine, then you already, and if you say Augustine, that's perfectly acceptable, by the way. It's just, this is the way I say it. I don't know what to say. If you've read Augustine, then you probably understand that, yes, he comes from a religious point of view. He became a monk. He was a sophist traveling around northern Africa, which would be like in the Egypt area, going up into southern Europe, and eventually makes it, around to, I believe at some point he's in Rome, and he joins a monastery. And the story about St. Augustine becomes less mystical as time goes on, and I'm very grateful for that, because I would prefer to have not just a mystical tale to tell. The mystical tale, and I say mystical because it was always presented as some sort of magical thing that happened. If you understand the Catholic Church and their idea of saints, then you understand that saints intercede for humans on earth to God in heaven. Okay, that's sort of the short version. Augustine's mother was named Monica. Monica is known in the Catholic Church as Saint Monica. Why? Because she prayed every single day that her son, who she felt was, just into debauchery, and he overate, and too much drink, and too many women, and his, just absolute lust for money, she felt was evil, and it was pagan, and she wanted him to be a Christian. So she prayed every single day. And then one day, and I don't know if it was before or after she died, I want to say it was after she died, Augustine decided, it's probably time for me to clean up my life a little bit. So he writes this book called The Confessions. And in the Confessions, it is no holds barred, right? It is like straight up, here's everything I've been doing that's wrong. And you get some serious, really good thoughts out of the confession, such as, grant me patience, Lord, but hurry, right? Like that sort of, those aren't the exact words, but you kind of get the idea. And, my mind wants to do the right thing, but my body feels lust and hunger and desire and all of those other things. So he's confessing all of these, and he puts it out there in the Confessions. And then he writes a work called On Christian Doctrine. And it's called On Christian Doctrine because he has to find a way to make his old life, that is the pagan rhetoric sophist life, fit into the church. But there were a lot of reasons why the church did not like rhetoric. Let me just list off some, okay? It was pagan. It made you prideful because you believed you could know more than God. That type of philosophy was against God because you needed God to know what was going on and to know the truth, not some silly idea that you got somehow. Empirically, we can experience the world, but that is how the devil tempts us through, taste, smell, sight, feeling, and hearing. And that just opens us up for the devil to come right in, and we don't want to do that. Rhetoric also aroused the passions, which is interpreted in a number of different ways. There are two ways I interpret it. Number one, there is some satisfaction that comes from public speaking. If you are a person who enjoys that, you know this to be true. Tony Robbins, Matt Frazier, John Edwards, my favorite televangelist guy whose name I never remember, all of them get something out of the preaching or the proselytizing that they do. They just, public speaking, when you have an audience and they are cheering for you, rooting for you, listening to you, feels really good. Okay. The second way that that gets interpreted, arousing the passions, is to say that the devil wants to arouse the passions in order to get them, in order to get you tempted. And so, rhetoric is one of the ways that the devil does that. And you might be thinking to yourself, what does the devil have to do with rhetoric? Well, let's go with the story of Adam and Eve. Okay. Which again, remember, we're dealing with the Holy Roman Empire here. So the story of Adam and Eve goes like this. God created his first children. He created Adam. He told Adam to name all of the animals and the plants and all that. And he realized that Adam was lonely. So basically, so he took a rib from Adam and he formed Eve. Okay, fantastic. So far, no problem. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that this is how it happened. I'm not saying this isn't how it happened. I'm saying that is the narrative in the Bible, right? So, and obviously what they were following in the Holy Roman Empire. So the next step is that Eve is tempted by a serpent, a snake, a slimy thing that crawls on the ground, to eat fruit, a quince, I believe it was. We all say it was an apple, but it was actually a quince, I believe, to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And God had told them not to do that. But the devil said, you know why he wants you not to do that? It's because then you could become greater than he is. Okay, so Eve takes a bite of the apple and sees and says, oh my goodness, I have to take this to Adam. She goes to Adam and she says to Adam, hey, I was in the tree and I'm in the garden here with you, and I was near this tree and this serpent came along and told me that this was a good idea. And we, being the humans that we are, the fallible, the fallen, we ate the apple, the quince, and we enjoyed it. But at that point, we got knowledge. And we got so much knowledge that we realized that we were naked, that we were powerless, that we were different from each other. We didn't behave the same way. I should say Adam and Eve did that, not us. But it's metaphorical in a way for the fall of man, right? So if you read that story as a metaphor, that is the fall of man. If you read that story as truth, it's the story of how man has fallen. Humans have fallen, not just men. So what did the serpent do, or who was this serpent? Well, of course, the serpent was Satan, and that's what we say. It was Satan. And who is Satan? Well, Satan is the fallen angel Lucifer, who rules hell. Like, there's all different various stories about this, by the way. I'm not going to pick one for you, but and this is not a religious philosophy course, but I want you to understand that there were many, many reasons why people thought during the medieval period, during the Holy Roman Empire, that rhetoric was evil. So if St. Augustine was going to talk about using rhetoric in the church, the first thing he has to do is convince people that it's not evil. How does he do that? Well, first of all, he says, I'm not going to talk about rhetoric. This is not about rhetoric. I am rejecting rhetoric. So now let's talk about rhetoric. Literally, that's what it is. If you read the work, that's what's in there. I've noticed that your book gives you much, shorter clips or parts of these writings than they used to. And that's probably better for you. But if you read the whole thing, he first says, I'm not going to talk about rhetoric. Everybody expects me to. I'm not doing that. Now I'm going to talk about rhetoric. He has a number of reasons why rhetoric belongs in the church. Well, the big three are to teach, to preach, and to convert. Okay? We need to use the Bible and go out amongst the public and teach those who don't know about Jesus, preach to those who do, and convert those who know and don't believe. So teach, preach, and convert. Those are really the big three. That makes sense in the context of a church, right? You would want to do all three of those. And I would argue that the televangelists that we have today, using the grand style that they do, are preaching. They're giving us the pleasing things that we want to hear because we're already believers, right? I remember my mom, I was raised Catholic, just so you know. I don't know if I told you that yet, but my mom, when the Passion of Christ came out with Mel Gibson's whole big deal, I said to my mom, I am not going to see that movie. And it wasn't that I didn't think anybody else should. I just didn't want to see it. And she goes, well, that's okay, honey, because they're just preaching to the choir for you. This is really not intended for us. Now, I think my mom was like me. I don't want to see blood and guts and pain. I'm not good with that. I'm not good with watching movies like that. And I know that's what's coming, right? Because we know the end of the story. But that this movie was not made for people who already believed, right? Or already understood. Preaching is that same way. Preaching is not about converting. Which is why when there's like the really loud preachers in downtown Springfield or on campus, I'm like super annoyed because they're not preaching. They're yelling. They're claiming to use the Bible, but what's the preaching going on? Because you're not preaching to the choir at that point, right? As we say, that's where that metaphor comes from. So he says there's three reasons that we use rhetoric in the church, and we should continue to do that. So then you might ask, well, how does that cancel out all of the bad things about rhetoric, like that it's pagan, that it's practiced by pagans, that it arouses the passions, it does all these other things? And he says, well, first things first, we don't get our knowledge from ourselves. We only get knowledge from God. So in order to not become prideful, which, by the way, if you pay attention, that is the deadliest of the 7 deadly sins, I believe. I believe that's the number one, like the worst sin. I think I'm right on that. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. We're not prideful if the first thing we do is go to God to understand what it is we're going to preach about or teach about or talk about. Okay? So how do we do that? Before you speak, in any context, according to St. Augustine, you should pray. Ask God to put the truth into you so that you can share it with others. And as long as you do that, you're not saying, I'm greater than God. You're saying, I am getting my information from God. And that's why it's the truth. And that's why it's going to come through me to you. One of the last reasons why Augustine says that we should use rhetoric in the church, and again, remember the context, this is the time period. He said that another reason is because, well, the devil used it first. The devil still uses it to tempt us. Don't you think we should fight back and have the same tools at our disposal that he has? And so he turns rhetoric into this not a good or a bad thing, but a tool to be used for either good or evil. And this is really where we start to get that distinction between rhetoric being good or bad, or rhetoric being a tool that's neutral and used for good or evil. Oh boy, that's 23 minutes on St. Augustine. I don't think I've ever gone just like that on St. Augustine. In the end of his work, though, he says, if you've read this and you don't understand it, go back and read it again. If you think it's too long, that's because you don't understand the work. If you were bored by it, that's because, you are bored easily by God's truth, and you should probably study some more and go back and read it again. And he basically just says, if you didn't understand my work, you're too dumb to understand it. So, it's a lengthy work. You guys don't have the whole thing. It is a lengthy work with excruciating detail. One last thing I'm going to say about Augustine is he did do us another favor in rhetoric outside of the religious, which was he said that, yes, we should teach, preach, and convert. Fine. I teach. We all teach. Some of us are preaching to our friends and to others. And sometimes I want to convert people, persuade people to my way of thinking, right? So we can utilize those. He associates style from Cicero with each of these. So I already kind of gave away the preaching one. The preaching one is the grand style. You should use the grand style, be extremely big and flamboyant and charismatic when you're preaching, because you're not telling them something new and you're not having to convert them. So how are you going to keep it interesting? They already are with you. You're literally preaching to the choir, right? So if you're talking about something that everybody already agrees on, you need to be fired up. That's the grand style. Consider, sorry, I'm going to have to go back to about 1990 to 2008. 2016. I could go all the way up there. Politicians who are running for office, when they get all their people behind them, they don't need to sit there and say, here's why you should elect me. They get them riled up. It's called a rally, not a let me convince you to vote for me. A stump speech, sure. But a celebratory speech or a speech that's at a rally, those kinds of things are just supposed to whip people up. You use the grand style. If we're going to be teaching, then you want to use the formal middle style, because you're going to be teaching people who are going to learn as you go. And so they're going to know more and understand more. And therefore you can talk to them about what they need to know. It's less about persuasion. It's more about not entertainment. It's about teaching. All right. About learning and teaching. The final style, obviously, the common style, still a formal style of speaking, but the common style is for conversion. If you're talking to someone who has absolutely no idea what, I don't know, let's pick a membership of something. Let's go with crafters. Sorry, I looked at my crafting room. What crafters are like this special group of people, right? And when we get together, there's glitter everywhere and it's a mess. But we all understand each other and our obsession with crafting. A lot of other people may not. My husband has seen me craft and refuses to get into the game a little bit, so he's out. But if you're talking to people who never engaged in crafting before, or crocheting, or a specific art of any kind, you have to explain to them all the steps to get there. You can't expect them to be persuaded by your incredible talent. They need to be persuaded to convert over to enjoying crafting. I'm even laughing at myself at this point. Because you're talking to them at their level. Here's what crafting can do for you. Here's why you should consider crafting. Here's where you start. So you use the common style. So, to sum up, Augustine, former pagan, former sophist, converted into a Christian and explained why people didn't like rhetoric in the Middle Ages and also why they should use it, particularly in the church, for three main goals: to teach, to preach, and to convert, and that you should use the styles that are correct for each of those. But if you don't pray first and find truth through God, then you're not going to be able to be successful in rhetoric. And then last but not least, if you don't understand him, you're an idiot. Literally. I mean, that's almost exactly verbatim what he says. Not quite, but it's close. And of course, I say back, you're an idiot to St. Augustine. I'm sure he appreciates it. At the time that he was writing, there weren't a lot of readers and writers. So he was able to get away with, if you think that this treatise is too long, if you think it's boring, if you think that it doesn't make sense, that's on you. It's not on me. I need to do that more often. Huh. All right. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, and threats. As always, no threats. Don't give me a threat. Questions, comments, complaints can come to me in whichever form you wish. The next video is going to cover De Pizan, Ramus, and Bacon. And that's because we're going to be into the Renaissances and the trying to push towards the modern. All right. Okay, everybody, take care, stay healthy. I'll be in touch soon.